The Interstellar Defense Coalition Academy, perched on Thalaxis Prime's largest moon, like a particularly ambitious architectural statement, all gleaming spires and impossibly balanced platforms that defied both gravity and good taste. 17 species contributed their finest young warriors to this institution, each absolutely convinced that their particular evolutionary path had produced the galaxy's natural leaders. The Luminari built towers that scraped the dome ceiling because apparently height meant wisdom. The Skrell floated around on anti-gravity platforms because walking was beneath them, literally. The Threnody constructed underground warrens because sunlight was for lesser beings, and everyone else just built normal buildings with walls and floors, which frankly showed more common sense than the rest combined. Commander Zekthar surveyed the incoming class with his compound eyes, each one focused on a different cadet, which either meant he was extremely attentive or having the worst migraine in galactic history. His species, the Kickstal, had evolved on a world where being able to see in 17 directions simultaneously was the difference between eating lunch and being lunch. This made them excellent military commanders and terrible at surprise parties. "You represent the finest your worlds have offered," he announced through his translator implant, which rendered his ultrasonic clicks into something resembling inspiration. "Here, you will become the instruments of galactic peace." The irony of training professional violence specialists for peacekeeping was lost on precisely no one except Zekthar, whose species had evolved without the brain structures necessary for irony. They had, however, evolved excellent pattern recognition, which meant they were very good at warfare and very bad at comedy. Among the assembled cadets stood Tor Valexesh Kelmira, second heir to the Zenthari Trade Consortium, a being who had never encountered a mirror he didn't admire. The Zenthari were what happened when you gave a species perfect symmetry, natural armor plating, and an economic system based entirely on beauty standards. Standing 8 feet tall with iridescent carapace that shifted colors based on mood, 6 limbs that moved with practiced precision, and a vocal range that could shatter glass when properly motivated, Tor Valax represented everything his culture valued: aesthetic perfection, economic dominance, and the unshakable belief that everyone else existed to admire them. His people had built a commercial empire spanning 90 systems on the revolutionary economic principle that pretty things were worth more than ugly things. They had then codified this into law, created a currency based on aesthetic value, and somehow convinced half the galaxy that this made perfect sense. Financial analysts called it innovative. Everyone else called it what happens when you let the marketing department run civilization. "Observe this collection of mediocrity," Tor Valax murmured to his companion, a Velix named Crenshaw, who scuttled beside him with the desperate social climbing instincts of a being who knew they weren't pretty enough for Zenthari society, but hoped proximity might help. "Half cannot even maintain their own body temperature. Primitives playing at civilization. Absolute primitives," Crenshaw agreed enthusiastically, his multiple legs clicking against the parade ground in nervous rhythm. "I heard they accepted someone from an actual Deathworld this year. Category 9, if you can believe it." Tor Valax could not believe it, mainly because he had never bothered to learn what Deathworld classifications meant. Numbers were for accountants. The Galactic Habitability Index rated planets from 1 to 10 based on how enthusiastically they tried to kill their inhabitants. Level 1 worlds were the galactic equivalent of luxury resorts: stable climate, gentle gravity, minimal predators, weather that politely stayed within comfortable parameters. Most coalition species evolved on level 1 or 2 worlds, where the most dangerous animal could usually be defeated by loud noises and aggressive pointing. Earth rated level 9. This should have been prominently featured in every human cadet's file, ideally with flashing lights and perhaps a small alarm. Instead, it was buried in subsection 7.2 of the species integration documentation, which nobody read, because it was 400 pages long and written by bureaucrats who believed that comprehensiveness was more important than comprehension. The human in question stood near the back of the formation, average height for her species, which meant most aliens looked down at her literally, while she looked down on them metaphorically. Her name was Keiko Adeyemi, though she introduced herself as Adeyemi because she'd learned that aliens struggled with human-given names, the way fish struggle with bicycles. Her skin was the deep brown that came from ancestors who'd survived equatorial sun, and her hair was bound in tight coils that defied Zenthari beauty standards and most known laws of physics. Her expression suggested she was performing complex mental calculations, which she was, specifically, calculating how many more minutes until she could leave this pointless ceremony. She'd grown up in the Nairobi-Tokyo megapolis, where rush hour was deadlier than most species combat training, and she'd joined the Coalition Academy because it was the only scholarship that would get her off Earth without requiring criminal activity. Torvalax noticed her the way aristocrats notice servants, peripherally, dismissively, and with the vague distaste reserved for things that don't sparkle. "What is that supposed to be?" he asked, gesturing with one of his 6 arms toward Adeyemi. "Human," Crenshaw supplied, accessing his datapad. "From Earth. Sol system. Barely met minimum qualifications. Required gravity adaptation protocol. Temperature regulation assistance. Bone density concerns noted." Concerning how? For them, presumably. High-gravity world but delicate skeletal structure. Doesn't make evolutionary sense, but Deathworld biology rarely does. Torvalax filed this information in the mental drawer labeled beneath my concern, which was getting quite crowded these days. The Academy operated on educational principles refined over 3 centuries, expose cadets to increasingly lethal scenarios, and evaluate who maintained both competence and sanity. This was considered progressive compared to the old system, which had involved actual death. So relatively speaking, they were making excellent progress toward humane military education. Training divided into 4 primary categories: physical combat, tactical simulation, survival scenarios, and cultural integration. Physical combat was where species hierarchies got established through the time-honored tradition of hitting each other until somebody fell down. The combat gymnasium was a temple to controlled violence, complete with weapon racks organized by species grip compatibility and training floors that adjusted density based on participant physiology. Instructor Vaxitrel, a Korathi who resembled a mountain that had developed opinions and anger management issues, presided over the space with the enthusiasm of someone who genuinely loved watching youngsters discover their physical limitations. Rotation sparring, she announced in a voice like grinding tectonic plates. Random partner assignments. Non-lethal force only, but I reward enthusiasm with better grades. The holographic assignment board cycled through names with the cold algorithmic indifference that suggested the computer either had perfect logic or a cruel sense of humor. Possibly both. Torvalax drew a Quellian, one of those amphibious species whose entire combat strategy involved being slippery and hoping their opponent got frustrated and quit. He ended the match in 52 seconds by simply picking up the Quellian and placing them outside the boundary ring. Technical victory. Aesthetically perfect execution. 0 actual effort. He returned to the ready line already thinking about lunch. Adeyemi got paired with a Kronar, which was essentially what happened when evolution looked at bears, decided they weren't intimidating enough, and added extra mass plus bad attitude. The Kronar outweighed her by 300 pounds and had 6-inch claws that it was very proud of. The match lasted 8 seconds. The Kronar charged with the confidence that came from never having lost a fight. Adeyemi sidestepped with economy of movement that suggested she'd done this before, grabbed one of those impressive claws mid-swipe, used the Kronar's own momentum to redirect it, and introduced its face to the training mat with enough force to trigger the automatic knockout sensors. She was walking back to the ready line before the medical sensors confirmed the Kronar was merely unconscious rather than dead. Torvalax watched this with the kind of attention you give to unexpected competence in unlikely places. Luck, obviously. The Kronar had overcommitted. Sloppy technique. Nothing to do with the human skill. Over the following weeks, the Academy settled into its predictable rhythms. Social hierarchies formed based on species prestige and individual charisma. Torvalax naturally gravitated toward the apex of this pyramid, surrounded by other high-caste species who believed their genetic lottery wins were actually personal achievements. Adeyemi remained peripheral, not through social failure but through apparent disinterest in the whole hierarchy game. She attended classes, completed assignments with the mechanical efficiency of someone working through a checklist, and spent her free time either reading technical manuals or performing exercise routines that made other species physically uncomfortable to observe. Why does she do that? Crenshaw asked one evening, watching through the gymnasium observation window as Adeyemi performed what humans called pull-ups. She'd been at it for 30 minutes without stopping, which should have been physiologically impossible for someone her size. Do what? Torvalax asked, not particularly interested but willing to humor his designated inferior friend. That. The repetitive muscle contractions. No resistance fields, no gravity manipulation. Just her mass against natural gravity. Primitive training methods for primitive species. She's done 217 repetitions. Irrelevant. But it wasn't. Irrelevant, not really, and Torvalax found himself watching despite his cultivated disinterest. Adeyemi wasn't the strongest cadet by raw power metrics. She wasn't the fastest in sprint trials. She didn't top the tactical examination scores. But she had something else. Something that made instructors pause and review her combat footage multiple times. Something that lived in her movements like compressed springs waiting for release. The Zenthari delegation at the academy numbered 12 cadets, all from prominent merchant families, all completely certain of their inevitable greatness. They moved through campus like a royal procession, and other species made space because centuries of commercial dominance had taught everyone that arguing with Zenthari was expensive, time-consuming, and ultimately pointless. Torvalax led this group through pure pedigree and the kind of charisma that came from never hearing the word no. The incident began, as most disasters do, with something completely avoidable. The academy cafeteria operated on democratic first-come seating, which some species found offensive to their social order. Torvalax arrived with his entourage at the lunch hour to find their customary table occupied by Adeyemi, who sat alone with a datapad propped against her tray, completely absorbed in whatever technical manual she was studying this week. You, Torvalax said, infusing the single syllable with all the imperial authority 3 generations of merchant princes could muster. Relocate. Adeyemi looked up slowly, the kind of slow that communicated she'd heard him perfectly well the first time, and was now deciding whether his existence mattered enough to acknowledge. Her eyes focused on Torvalax, with the flat assessment you'd give a minor annoyance. No, she said simply, then returned to her reading. The cafeteria's ambient noise level dropped like someone had turned down the universe's volume knob. Crenshaw made a small squeaking noise. Aquelian 2 tables over actually stopped eating, which for amphibious species was basically a panic response. I do not believe you comprehend the social dynamics at play here, Torvalax said, his carapace shifting to the deep purple that indicated strained patience. I am Torvalax Kelmira, second heir to, yeah, I got it, important family. Very impressive resume. Probably have a really nice house. Adeyemi interrupted without looking up. Still not moving. Plenty of other tables. You have 6 arms. Carrying a tray shouldn't be challenging. A wiser being might have recognized this as an opportunity to preserve dignity through strategic withdrawal. Torvalax was not that being. He'd been raised in a culture where backing down meant commercial weakness, which in Zenthari society was basically admitting you were worthless. His entire species had confused never compromise with good leadership, which explained a lot about their trade negotiation reputation. In my culture, Torvalax said, his voice dropping to the register that preceded violence. Such disrespect requires physical correction. In my culture, Adeyemi replied, finally setting down her datapad and looking directly at him. People who can't handle minor inconveniences need therapy, not a table. The cafeteria had achieved the kind of silence usually reserved for religious ceremonies or imminent disasters. Other cadets were calculating intervention and angles. Instructors were still 30 seconds away. The moment balanced on a knife edge. What happened next occupied approximately 4 seconds of objective time, but those 4 seconds would be dissected, analyzed, and taught as a case study in catastrophically poor decision-making for the next 2 decades. Torvalax, operating on generations of aristocratic entitlement and exactly 0 real-world combat experience outside controlled training environments, decided that physical discipline was appropriate. In his culture, a strike across the face was how superiors corrected social inferiors. It was ritualized, measured, and carried specific cultural meaning about hierarchy and respect. He struck Adeyemi across the face with his primary right hand, an open palm blow that carried enough force to stagger a Zenthari child but was, in his estimation, measured and appropriate for the offense. The sound of impact cracked through the silent cafeteria. Adeyemi's head snapped to the side. For one moment, she sat absolutely still, processing. Then she stood up, and that's when everyone should have started running. Here's the thing about Earth that the Coalition species documentation mentioned, but nobody actually internalized. Earth was a planet that had spent 4 billion years actively trying to murder everything on its surface. The gravity was 1.3 times galactic standard, which meant every step was weight training. The atmospheric oxygen sat at levels most species considered mildly toxic. The sun bombarded the surface with radiation that necessitated an entire organ system dedicated to cellular repair. The tectonic plates were in constant aggressive negotiation, producing earthquakes, volcanoes, and tsunamis with enthusiastic regularity. The weather achieved temperature extremes ranging from lethal by freezing to lethal by cooking, sometimes in the same geographic location within the same day. Evolution on Earth wasn't a gentle process of adaptation. It was a 4 billion year-long cage match where only the most paranoid, most violent, and most stubbornly persistent organisms survived long enough to reproduce. Humans had evolved persistence hunting, which meant their ancestors literally chased prey animals until the prey died of exhaustion. They developed throwing arms capable of accelerating projectiles to lethal velocities. Their skeletal structure was dense enough to support high-gravity locomotion and survive falls that would shatter most species' bones. Their pain tolerance was calibrated for an environment that regularly inflicted damage as part of normal existence. Their healing capabilities were robust enough to recover from injuries that would kill most galactic species outright. And critically, terrifyingly, importantly, humans had evolved with a baseline assumption that everything around them was potentially lethal, which meant their threat response system didn't have a mild response setting. It went from 0 to eliminate the threat permanently with no intermediate stops. Adeyemi processed the strike through 4 million years of evolutionary programming. She wasn't seriously injured, her cheek was already darkening with what would become a spectacular bruise, but nothing was broken. However, her hindbrain, that ancient piece of neural architecture that predated language and civilization by millions of years, identified Torvalix as a threat that had just initiated violence. And human hindbrains had very simple threat response protocols. She punched him in the face. To be more technically specific, she threw a straight right cross with her entire body weight behind it, rotating her hips and shoulders with the efficient biomechanics that humans had been perfecting since they figured out that fists were excellent tools for conflict resolution. Her knuckles, backed by metacarpal bones that had evolved to survive high-gravity impacts, connected with Torvalix's face, with approximately 850 pounds of force concentrated into an area smaller than a credit chip. The crunch was audible across the cafeteria and probably in adjacent rooms. Torvalix's elegant carapace, that beautiful display of genetic superiority and aesthetic perfection, shattered like decorative glass. His facial structure, designed primarily for visual appeal rather than impact resistance, collapsed inward in ways that would make anatomists weep. 4 of his 6 eyes ruptured from the pressure differential, his mandibles separated from his skull in 3 distinct places, which shouldn't have been anatomically possible, but human fists apparently disagreed with Zenthari anatomy about what was possible. He went down like a puppet with severed strings, which was generous, because puppets usually maintained better structural integrity during falls. The cafeteria exploded into chaos. Cadets were screaming, alarms were triggering. Someone activated the emergency medical alert that made lights flash in patterns that definitely meant something to somebody, probably. Adeyemi looked down at Torvalix's collapsed form, flexed her right hand once to assess for damage, noted some split knuckles, but nothing serious, and said with perfect calm, "Told you there were other tables." Then she picked up her datapad and walked out while 3 separate emergency medical teams rushed in with equipment and panic. The Academy Medical Facility was state-of-the-art, which meant it had technology capable of regrowing limbs, curing diseases that had plagued species for millennia, and performing surgery with molecular-level precision. What it was not prepared for was the kind of comprehensive facial destruction that required 16 hours of surgery and 5 specialist consultations from different medical disciplines. Chief Medical Officer Thrensall stared at the scans with the expression of someone whose entire understanding of biology was being actively questioned by reality. "This doesn't make any sense," she said for the gray, seventh time, her sensory tendrils twitching with agitation. "Xanthari carapace is grade 5 density. It shouldn't fracture from a simple unarmed strike. We've seen them survive direct plasma burns. Human bone structure is grade 7 density," her assistant offered, pulling up comparative anatomical overlays. "Higher than most species. Their skeletal system evolved under high gravity with significant impact stress modeling. That still doesn't explain this level of catastrophic damage. Look at this scan. Complete structural failure across the entire facial region. The force required would be," she paused, running calculations, "approximately 850 pounds per square inch concentrated impact. For a human of her body mass to generate that force, she'd need perfect kinetic chaining." And she stopped, pulling up the combat footage that security had already flagged. "She did use perfect kinetic chaining," she said slowly. "This wasn't a reflex response. This was trained strike mechanics. Full hip rotation, shoulder engagement, fist structure optimized for impact transfer." Thrensall absorbed this information. "You're telling me this human has trained specifically to optimize violence delivery?" "I'm telling you all humans train to optimize violence delivery. It's in their cultural documentation. Combat sports, martial arts, boxing, mixed martial arts. They have entire entertainment industries built around watching each other fight. For fun? That seems maladaptive. For species from level 1 worlds, yes. For species from level 9 death worlds, where everything is actively trying to kill you, it's just practical skill development." Thrensall pulled up Adeyemi's species file. Something she absolutely should have done before now, but hadn't because humans were classified as a minor species, and who had time to read documentation for every minor species. She read it now. The file was 83 pages long, which should have been her first warning sign. Most species files were 8 pages maximum. Planet of origin, Earth, Sol system, Orion Spur environmental classification. Level 9 Deathworld primary hazards. Extreme temperature variance, 89 degrees Celsius to plus 57 degrees Celsius surface range. Elevated gravity, 1.3x standard, high radiation exposure, active tectonic system, volatile weather patterns, elevated atmospheric oxygen, potential fire hazard. Extensive megafauna predator ecosystem, aggressive microbial environment. Biological adaptations, dense skeletal structure, grade 7, robust cardiovascular system, redundant healing mechanisms. Elevated pain, tolerance estimated 3x standard. Persistence endurance capability, advanced thermoregulation, pattern recognition optimization, social cooperation imperative, tool use sophistication. Psychological profile, high stress tolerance, strong pack loyalty, creative problem solving, tendency toward pack bonding with non-species entities, humor as stress management mechanism, persistence despite adversity, competitive drive threat assessment, elevated exercise, extreme caution in combat scenarios. And there, buried in subsection 9.7, a note that someone had flagged, but apparently nobody had actually read. Human physical capabilities significantly exceed baseline assessment assumptions. Species demonstrates disproportionate strength to mass ratio, exceptional endurance capacity, and combat optimization, suggesting strong evolutionary selection for violence. Cultural analysis indicates humans have engaged in continuous intraspecies warfare for entire recorded history, approximately 10,000 years. Integration into coalition military structures should proceed with comprehensive behavioral briefing and combat capability acknowledgement. Do not assume physical inferiority based on size. "Oh," Thrensall said very quietly. "Oh no." "Oh no what?" her assistant asked nervously. "We've been treating them like level 2 species. They're short, and they have soft skin, and they complain about temperature regulation. They're short and soft things that evolved on a planet that actively tried to murder them every single day, which means short and soft is their relaxed state. Do you understand what that implies?" The assistant did not understand, but was about to learn. The surgery continued for another 12 hours. They managed to reconstruct Tor Valax's face into something that vaguely resembled its original configuration, though he would never look the same. The beautiful iridescent carapace was gone, replaced with synthetic plating that didn't shift colors properly. 3 eyes were beyond repair, leaving him with asymmetrical vision. His mandible would never align correctly again, leaving him with permanent structural dysfunction that Xanthari culture would find deeply disturbing. When he finally woke in the recovery ward, groggy from anesthesia and profoundly confused, his first question was, "What happened?" "You struck a Deathworld Cadet," Thrensal said with the flat delivery of someone whose patience had been exhausted hours ago. She struck back, "You lost catastrophically." "That's impossible. She's half my size and has soft skin." Size is not the determining factor in combat effectiveness. Neither is surface appearance. Humans evolved as apex predators on a level 9 death world. You are an accountant's descendant from a level 2 commercial hub. What did you think would happen? Xanthari are superior in Xanthari. Thrensal interrupted with a kind of exhaustion that came from 16 hours of reconstructive surgery. Evolved on a world where the most dangerous predator could be frightened away by being slightly larger than it. Humans evolved on a world where they were the apex predator, and everything else learned to be afraid or died. Do you understand the difference? This information collided with Tor Valax's worldview like a meteor hitting a soap bubble. He did what most beings do when confronted with reality that contradicts their beliefs. He rejected it. "I want her. Expelled. Criminal charges. Assault prosecution. You struck her first. Multiple witnesses confirm this. By coalition law, she was within her rights to defend herself. The fact that you catastrophically underestimated her defensive capabilities is not a legal issue. It's a personal failure of judgment." The investigation that followed was mercifully brief, because security footage captured everything in perfect high-definition detail. Tor Valax initiating contact. Adeyemi attempting verbal de-escalation. Tor Valax striking first. Adeyemi's response, which looked even more devastating, in slow motion. The review board consisted of 4 species representatives and Commander Zekthar, who watched the footage 17 times from 17 different visual angles simultaneously, and wore the expression of someone who had just realized they'd made a terrible administrative mistake that would generate mountains of paperwork. "Assessments?" he asked the board. "Human operated within defensive parameters," the Quellian representative said nervously. "Xanthari initiated physical contact," the Lithoid agreed, their voice grinding like stone. "Response was proportional to perceived threat level," the third representative added, though their tone suggested they weren't entirely confident about the proportional part. "She destroyed his face," Zekthar observed. "He struck a being from a level 9 death world and expected no consequences. That's not her failure. That's his failure to understand basic threat assessment." Zekthar sighed the sigh of commanders throughout galactic history who had to defend decisions they didn't agree with but couldn't logically argue against. No charges filed. Official warnings issued to both cadets. And someone update the species integration protocols before another idiot decides to hit a human. The Academy transformed after that incident, in small ways that accumulated into significant cultural shift. Human cadets suddenly received wider berth in corridors. Training partners approached them with noticeable caution. The casual dismissiveness evaporated, replaced by wary respect that none of the humans had requested but all of them noticed. Adeyemi found the entire situation exhausting. She hadn't wanted to hit Tor Valax. She'd wanted to eat her lunch and finish reading about advanced propulsion systems. But he'd made choices. Choices had consequences. And if those consequences included reconstructive surgery, well, perhaps better choices should have been made. Tor Valax returned to classes 5 weeks later, his face a patchwork of prosthetics and synthetic plating that made other Xanthari visibly uncomfortable. His social standing had collapsed as thoroughly as his facial structure. Other high-caste cadets avoided him, not from sympathy, but because association with failure was contagious in their culture. He sat alone at meals now, always at tables far from wherever Adeyemi happened to be eating. 3 months after the incident, a tactical simulation assigned Tor Valax and Adeyemi to the same team. The scenario involved hostage extraction, which required coordination, communication, and trust. They completed the mission in record time with 0 casualties. Afterward, in the debriefing room, while other team members celebrated, Torvalax approached Adeyemi directly for the first time since the cafeteria. "Why didn't you strike to kill?" he asked quietly, his synthesized voice lacking the melodic qualities Zenthari were known for. Adeyemi looked at him, this shattered aristocrat who'd learned humility through emergency surgery. "Because you hit me like you were disciplining a child," she said matter-of-factly. "I figured you didn't know better. If you'd hit me like you actually wanted to hurt me, different story. I genuinely believed I was superior to you. To all humans. Yeah. I noticed. I don't believe that anymore. Good. Now you can actually start learning things instead of just assuming you already know them." Torvalax nodded carefully, a gesture that pulled at his reconstructed mandible in ways that were probably uncomfortable. "For what it's worth," he said, "I apologize." Apology accepted. Pro tip: don't hit people. Seems like a simple rule, but apparently it needs saying. The academy year continued its relentless progression. Cadets graduated. New classes arrived. The story of the Deathworld Cadet and the aristocrat who learned physics the painful way became part of academy legend, told and retold until it achieved mythological status. Commander Zekdar personally updated the species integration protocols. The new version was significantly longer and included an entire section on humans with a header that read, "Do not assume fragility equals weakness." He considered adding flashing lights, but settled for bold red text. The Zenthari High Council quietly recalled several of their cadets, including Torvalax, who returned home to a family profoundly ashamed of his disfigurement and what it represented in their appearance-obsessed culture. He would spend the next decade in social rehabilitation, learning humility through systematic ostracism. Adeyemi graduated with honors, though her academic performance hadn't changed at all. She received offers from 19 different military branches and chose the one promising minimal bureaucracy, which turned out to be a cargo transport division patrolling boring sectors where nothing interesting ever happened. She was perfectly fine with boring. Years later, when a junior officer asked her about the incident after hearing the legend, she shrugged and said, "Guy hit me. I hit back harder. He had a bad day." End of story. And it was the end of the story, more or less, except for the part where the Coalition quietly updated threat assessment protocols for all Deathworld species, and the part where Zenthari combat academies started including mandatory seminars on not assuming superiority based on aesthetics, and the part where humans developed a galaxy-wide reputation as beings you really, truly, absolutely should not provoke unless you enjoyed reconstructive surgery. The galaxy learned what Earth had always known, that the most dangerous beings aren't always the largest or the strongest or the prettiest, but the ones who evolved in places where everyday survival required constant optimization for violence, and who carried that optimization with them wherever they went like carefully maintained luggage. And perhaps most importantly, the galaxy learned that hierarchies built on assumptions rather than evidence tend to collapse spectacularly, usually in front of witnesses, frequently requiring emergency medical intervention. The Interstellar Defense Coalition Academy continued its mission of forging galactic peace through controlled violence. The crystalline towers still scraped the dome. The anti-gravity platforms still floated with unnecessary flair. The normal buildings still did their jobs with quiet efficiency. And in the cafeteria, there was now a small plaque mounted on one particular table that read, "Reserved seating, first come, first served. No exceptions, seriously. We have medical bills to prove it." Nobody ever asked Adeyemi to move again. Torvalax eventually returned to civilian life, where he became an advocate for realistic threat assessment in commercial negotiations. He gave lectures on the dangers of assumption-based superiority, and he was very, very careful about where he sat at lunch. And somewhere in the boring sectors of space, on a cargo transport that rarely encountered anything more exciting than paperwork, Adeyemi continued reading technical manuals, performing her exercise routines, and absolutely not thinking about that one time she accidentally became a galactic legend by having the audacity to defend herself. The universe continued spinning, species continued evolving, and humans continued being the kind of species that seemed harmless right up until you made the catastrophically poor decision to test that assumption. Some lessons the galaxy learned, were best learned vicariously through other people's medical bills.